It's Saturday, July 11th at 7 p.m., live from the stage of the Peterson Tech campus of the Westbrook Walnut Grove High School. I'm Heidi Morgan. Some of you may know me as Old Laura, who I portray in the Wilder Pageant. I actually grew up in Walnut Grove. I spent the better part of my childhood days living only a mile and a half away from Laura's actual dugout site, Plum Creek, and the Big Rock. And as Laura, I have many fond memories of growing up in such a nice community as Walnut Grove. After last night's long horse ride to get to Walnut Grove, perhaps we found the Nelsons who took us in for the night. After washing up in Plum Creek, we are excited to continue Laura's Prairie Summer, a 6-part mini-series over the next 3 weekends. We have a mixture of live and recorded scenes, special guests, and more. This is episode 2. Not far south, a few days by wagon, where the corn is tall and the Trundlebed Tales flourish, our guest has traveled to meet us here and to share her love of history and her passion for understanding how pioneers lived. Please welcome Sarah Uthoff. Sarah, what started your passion for history and Laura Ingalls Wilder?
Well, when my mom was pregnant with me, one of her friends said, "Oh, if you're going to have a little girl, you have to get these Laura Ingalls Wilder books." So my mom started looking at garage sales, and she gathered them all up. So before I can even remember, people were always reading me the Laura books. And I live on the family farm, so a lot of things that people consider history is stuff that I do. So history kind of came in that way.
There's a clock. Any specific Laura Ingalls Wilder book that would be your favorite?
I really like to think of them as one big story. So it's hard to break them down into individual titles. But the one that I have the most affinity for is On the Banks of Plum Creek there in Walnut Grove. It's got, I think, the best stories and the ones that I like to tell the most. So I would say that. The Long Winter, though, is, I think, the best designed of the books. Uh-huh. It is if you look at it, it's very clever. You wouldn't necessarily notice it, but there's butterflies right at the beginning and right at the end. And in between, you start seeing these snowflakes, just a few of them, and then pretty soon there's so many they come off the page. And I just love them.
Oh. In your research, what events or information, as you've been a writer, came as a surprise or was unexpected to you?
Well, I should say that I feel a really strong kinship for Laura because of my grandmother. And so she lived a lot of the things Laura did. So I can't say that there was a lot of surprise because I knew about a farm wife. That's probably the area of her life that I am more interested in, even as a little girl with the books are set, is what she did creating a farm and creating a community. And that story isn't one that gets enough focus on it, I think. I think that's really an area to get into because as you know, the importance of older Laura, she did not stay with braids and a short dress her whole life. So that's the thing I think is most interesting that people probably don't think about.
Laura Ingalls Wilder's writings have been criticized for being culturally insensitive. What is your perspective about these concerns?
Well, for one thing, I don't think that people should judge the books necessarily by all the things that happen in them, because if you have a character like Mrs. Scott in Little House on the Prairie who says the only good Indian is a dead Indian, is that would be the same thing as saying a book about a murder who has the murderer say it's okay to kill, or, it would be the same thing. It isn't really that the book's saying that or that the hero's saying that. It's, people that aren't really liked or well thought of. I also think that a lot of kids gloss right over that. They, for example, there's a book called Shepherd of the Hills by Harold Bell Wright. And it has the most beautiful description in it, and I loved everything about it as a kid. And I reread it as an adult and figured out there was this whole A story going on, that everything I liked was the B story. And I think a lot of kids are like that. They're not really focusing on the issues. And I think it is also important to talk about the issues, because really, it's part of our history, and you try and sanitize what happened and you've lost an important part to figure out how we got here and where we're going in the future.
Sure. I always said we need to know where we were in order to know how we got to where we are now. We need to look back. You spoke of one other writer, but what other writers and works would you compare to Wilder's writings and recommend for those who enjoy Laura Ingalls Wilder's books?
Well, I would probably recommend any of the Ella Montgomery books. The Anne series especially is a similar girl going through the process of growing up. That one's on P.E. Island in Canada, but it's a similar framed story. And the Betsy Tacy books by Maud Hart Lovelace. And they're not really the same as Laura's books. They have an older protagonist, but I also like the Gene Stratton Porter books, especially Laddie, A True Blue Story, and the Freckles series.
Now, we cannot speak enough of Wilder's works without considering other works that have inspired, including movies and plays and television series. Mm-hmm. What value do they add to or detract from the message that she sought to convey?
Well, I think that she'd be very pleased that they're spreading the story of her family, Ma and Pa and Mary and her and Carrie and Grace, and that it's important to try your best, to go ahead even if you're afraid, to try to be a good person, to know the difference between right and wrong, and if you are caught short on something, that you just have to make do and come up with the best you can. And I think that's true about pretty much every production. And I believe that these other productions do direct at least some people back to the books. So I think that's really an important function. I think, for instance, the 1974 series, which people in Walnut Grove always love, because I always like to ask people when I do my presentations, how many times does it say Walnut Grove and On the Banks of Plum Creek? And you probably know, do you?
Oh, you're catching me on this one.
0.
Oh,
It says Walnut Grove. It says, let's go to school in town, or let's go to church in town. It never says the name of the town. So, and that's why you guys like the TV show, because they said it like 12 times in the first episode and you were on the map. But I think that it has done an incredible job of directing people to the books that might never have found them otherwise. So I think you can get other ideas from adaptions, but I really think, and they're really enjoyable a lot of the time, but I really think their most important role is getting people back to the books, because I really think they have unique qualities, unique descriptions, and I think people get a lot out of reading them. I have had a lot of people. I do public speaking about Laura a lot of times, and I have people come up to me, and they quite frequently say how much she helped them of. The things I said before. And they even sometimes tell me they've named their daughter for Laura. So I just really think they're incredibly powerful books and that people should be reading them.
And getting back to the what you said about her mentioning the town and in her books, she did in real life, and it is at the museum in Walnut Grove, write a letter to the editor of the paper at the time, Charles Lance, apologizing for not having mentioned Walnut Grove, the town, in her book. She said she was just writing children's stories and had no idea she was writing history. So that is... she was made aware of that.
I wish Charles Lance got more credit. I think he did some amazing amount of spade work, getting everything on Laura going in Walnut Grove. I got to see the Walnut Grove, so the Tribune, Walnut Grove Tribune building when I was there, and I'm interested in the history of the site, so things impress me that maybe not impressed other people.
Laura and her daughter Rose certainly had some strong opinions, both as writers, and during their lifetime, did they connect with or conflict with other prominent figures of their time? Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I would say that there are figures that they did both. Both of them really didn't like FDR for what I think are good and sundry reasons, though other people might object, and were really quite vocal about that dislike in their letters and sometimes even in public. But there were other people that they, valued, they always say that George Patton, I think that's right, had written a letter to Laura that said how they were glad that he was, or that they could use her book Long Winter during the recovery period in Japan, that people were associating it with that. And whether he actually did write the letter, it's hard to tell, but there were definitely connections there. And I think Rose especially knew a lot of famous writers because she was really in the writers' community on both coasts and in Europe to some extent.
A number of Wilder's works have been published after her death. Are there some that she may rather not have seen published, or those she would have liked to have completed before her death? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know that she would be really crazy about the first 4 years or Pioneer Girl having been published. They were still very much in draft form, and she put a lot of effort into the editing. They said Ursula Nordstrom, who was with her publisher in New York, said that there were only 2 authors whose works came in not really needing any editing, and it was Laura's and E.B. White. And E.B. White did his himself, and Laura went through a long editing process with Rose. And so to have these sort of draft things published, I don't know that she'd appreciate it, but I think that she would be very glad to know that people were interested in her and her family and her books and still wanted to know things. And I think there's a lot of things that have been published that she would be amazed that they had been published, but she would be very glad of. It's some things not just by her, but by other people like Barbara Walker's Little House Cookbook, or Eugenia Garson's Little House on the Prairie. no, it's Laura Ingalls Wilder songbook. And to have an actual set of her selected letters published, like the one William Anderson did quite recently, I think she would have been very impressed with that. So I think for the most part, she'd be pleased.
From Pamela Smith, do you believe the Little House books remain relevant to the 21st century readers, and why or why not?
Well, I think they do remain relevant in terms of everything that you can get out of them. But where I think the problem might be, and I really am kind of scared of this, there are a lot of things in the Little House books that are great descriptions if you know what she's talking about. For example, in Little House on the Prairie, she says that a spider is a frying pan with legs. That is a great description if you know what a frying pan is. How many kids today have seen their parents cook in a frying pan on the stove? And there are lots of incidents like that. And it's that kids today haven't been taught enough about life today to make those connections back. And that is the lack of connection that I'm concerned about. And it isn't just that they can't read the Laura books as well, because, I think they would have a poorer life, but it isn't like they're anything. But if you don't know it, and you're asked to make decisions about things, about history that you're not understanding, or like about farming and how that works and how food works, you can get in a pretty dangerous place. So I really hope people work a little bit more when they have kids with teaching them how to do some things that, that in a generation back would have been considered that no one would need to teach it because it would just be life.
Sarah, what are you working on currently?
Oh, I am always working on too much stuff. At present, I'm actually I've been working on some updates of my presentation, but in terms of a project I'm working on, which I haven't gotten far enough that I should really say it, but a lot of the Laura books that have come out lately have come with a very Eastern perspective. They've been written by people who live and were raised in the East, and I think that there's a lot of stuff in the books that should be explained by a Midwesterner. And I am starting to work on that, and we'll see if I actually get it done or not. But I really think someone should write that because, it's easy to think, oh my, that's something new and unique if you've never seen it done before. But if it's something everybody in the Midwest knows, you could easily misunderstand it.
Sure.
So that is my project. And if anybody out in the Midwest has some suggestions for that, I would be glad to get them.
Okay. And last question, Sarah, how many times have you been to the Laura Ingalls Wilder Pageant? I know you've been there a number of times, but...
Yes. Well, I'm wearing my T-shirt for the pageant. I've been a lot of times. When I was little, my mom was taking me on a trip to Pepin for my birthday, and then she said that she had filled out a little card for AAA saying where we were going to go, and it said, and we're going to stop at Maple Grove. And I said, oh, did you mean Walnut Grove? And she said, oh, no, Maple Grove is, and she had met Walnut Grove, so she had to fix it. And so I went once then, and I've been quite a few times. I've probably seen the pageant 10 or 12 times, I used to stay with Shirley Knockmoose, so that was always nice to have a place to stay in Walnut Grove.
Sure.
And, it gets better all the time. I always tell people that the Walnut Grove pageant, now the other two pageants in DeSmet and Mansfield, well worth seeing, but the one in Walnut Grove is like the Hollywood version with the special effects grasshoppers and the flame of fire that goes whipping across the stage and the real animals, and it's just such an incredible production. If you haven't seen it, the sets are built on 2 railroad cars, so they can pull them back or put them out as they need them and spin them 180 degrees. And it is just so cool. So everybody, if you have not yet been to the Walnut Grove pageant, you have to go, because every Laura fan should do it at least once, probably more.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Looks like it's time to head to the barn. Later, Mrs. Fitch will remind us how to milk the cow so we have fresh milk for baking. Thank you again, Sarah, for being our guest. Any last thoughts or a favorite Laura quote before you head to the barn to help milk the cow?
The Laura quotes I find most useful are I like the most tend to be useful quotes. So one of my favorites is, it's not Susan's fault she's only a corn cob. So if you get irritated at anybody and all this having to be social distance and stuff, just say to yourself, it's not Susan's fault she's only a corn cob. And I think it'll help you out.
Thank you.